never happened. Boy, would you ban that from your vocabulary? Please don't ever use that phrase again, because everything we all said, the only things that haven't happened is monkeys haven't flown out of my butt yet, and pigs don't fly yet. Everything else. So there's this woman, she was living up in Oregon, and if the phone rings, it'll probably be the Queen, and I should take the call. But until she calls, let's move on. The popular line in mainstream media about voting by mail is, there's no evidence of any fraud whatsoever. Really? Was I born yesterday? That's not true. Earlier this year, in surprise, New Jersey, there were problems with mysterious uncounted mail-in ballots that made up 19% of total votes cast in a local election.
A Passaic County spokesman has said that 800 ballots were eliminated amidst ballot stuffing and bundling allegations. But 2,000 other ballots have been eliminated without an explanation, and those ballots might make a difference, considering one Patterson council race was decided by just 8 votes. A leading election law professor is calling Patterson's election a genuine fraud scandal.
Why are they doing this? Why are the Democrats? Just keep that in mind. Why? Weeks later, the New Jersey Attorney General charged 4 men with voting fraud charges, including 2 Patterson City Council members. All 4 men were charged with criminal conduct involving mail-in ballots. Nothing to see here. Move on. Last month in West Virginia, a mail carrier in Pendleton County, West Virginia, pled guilty to election fraud. He admitted to altering applications for absentee ballots, changing the requests from Democrat to Republican. During the 2018 midterm elections in North Carolina, a Republican political operative named Leslie Dowless was indicted and arrested for submitting absentee ballots that he filled out himself. This is a bipartisan crime. Everybody's doing it these days, kids, because it's easy. Interesting. Actual evidence of current mail-in voter fraud. But the media, Glenn, keeps saying there's zero evidence of fraud. Well, the media also somehow overlooked the Heritage Foundation's database of documented election fraud cases going all the way back to 1982. But no big deal. Just 1,290 proven instances of voter fraud with over 1,100 criminal convictions. There are 37 cases of fraud in the database involving mail-in ballots alone, just since the 2016 election. But sure, media, the idea that voting by mail is ripe for fraud, totally false. Amazingly, Democrats and the media have forgotten their own comments and reporting on the major problems with voting by mail. In 2005, a report by the Commission on Federal Election Reform, which was chaired by everybody's favorite bad president, Jimmy Carter, and former Secretary of State James Baker, concluded, quote, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. Have a peanut. Continuing the quote, vote buying schemes are far more difficult to detect when citizens vote by mail. Democrats and media love a good government commission report, but not that one. That was 2005. So, maybe they think humanity has grown a conscience since then, and voter fraud now will no longer be an issue. I showed you this headline earlier. Well, now the New York Times completely contradicts its own reporting from 2012. 8 years ago, they had a very different take on this issue. Votes cast by mail are less likely to be counted, more likely to be compromised, and more likely to be contested than those cast in a voting booth, statistics show. Election officials reject almost 2% of ballots cast by mail, double the rate for in-person voting. But wait, there's more. If you order now, quote, the trend of voting by mail will probably result in more uncounted votes, and it increases the potential for fraud. While fraud in voting by mail is far less common than innocent errors, it is vastly more prevalent than the in-person voting fraud that has attracted far more attention, election administrators say, end quote. So now, wait a minute. Not only is this the exact opposite of what the left is saying now and the media, in the light of our current messaging, this statement is unbelievable. Quote, voting by mail is now common enough and problematic enough that election experts say there have been multiple elections in which no one can say with confidence which candidate was the deserved winner, end quote. Do you notice that it is not counting? It's disenfranchised. They're not worried necessarily about votes that are ballot stuffed, although that is a big problem. They're worried that 2% of people who vote will just be dismissed. What do you think they're going to say? We know that's going to happen because their own reporting said that would happen. Now, if you're taking notes at home, and I urge you to, voting by mail was a real concern back in 2012 when Barack Obama was up for re-election. But there's nothing to worry about now that Trump is running for re-election. Got it? And anyone who still thinks Governor Andrew Cuomo hung the moon, he said this about voting by mail back in April of this year. Quote, it's a harder system to administer, and obviously it's a harder system to police writ large. People showing up, people actually showing ID is still the easiest system to assure total integrity, end quote. Oh, but now he loves it. Never forget, only President Trump is against voting by mail. In a presidential election, widespread fraud is unlikely, though voting by mail certainly swings open that door. As we've seen already in primaries across the U.S. this year, the much bigger problem than potential fraud is good old-fashioned human screw-ups and incompetence with mail-in ballots. In New Jersey, for example, the state postponed its primary for a month due to COVID. Then they decided to vote almost entirely by mail. In June, massive computer issues and the U.S. Postal Service delays caused thousands of people not to get their ballots until after the July 7th primary. Oops. The state's voter registration computer simply crashed repeatedly, leaving, quoting, local election officials without the ability to process thousands of vote-by-mail ballots in just 11 days before the New Jersey primary election, end quote. It got so bad the state's election director ordered officials to stop processing ballot requests. Your right to vote? Yeah, just another casualty of the pandemic. I'm sorry. During the March presidential primary in Florida, over 18,500 mail-in ballots did not count because they arrived after the deadline. Nevada, over 6,700 ballots did not count because of bad signatures. California's presidential primary in March, over 102,000 mail-in ballots were rejected. Most were disqualified for missing the deadline in California ballots. They have to be postmarked on or before Election Day and received within 3 days afterwards. But over 27,000 of them did not have a signature, nor did the signature match the one on record for the voter. For Pennsylvania's primary in June, Governor Tom Wolf extended the mail-in ballot deadline for some counties. As long as the ballots were postmarked by June 2nd, they could arrive as late as June 9th and still be counted. But by June 11th, there were still over 42,000 votes not tallied. That's a big, huge red flag for a state like Pennsylvania, where the presidential election may be close. In 2016, Trump won Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes. Wisconsin also struggled with mail-in ballots during the primary this year. Out of over 1.1 million ballots mailed in, a nullified ballot rate was 1.9%. That means 22,000 ballots were rejected. In 2016, Trump won Wisconsin by just 22,000 votes, 22,748 to be exact. Voting by mail brings all kinds of headaches in. If you want to make those headaches worse, try emailing your ballot. After Washington, D.C. got thousands of complaints from people who did not receive their ballot in the mail this year, they created an online ballot where you could just fill it out, save it as a PDF, and email it right there, higgledy-piggledy, to the elections office. What could go wrong? The roar of laughter you might hear, if you listen, Yeah, Russia and Chinese hackers laughing. And of course, New York wins the prize for most incompetent vote by mail system. It took 6 weeks after New York's June primary for 2 congressional races to be decided. In New York City, over 84,000 mail-in ballots were still invalid, mostly due to missing postmarks and signatures, but some due to delayed deliveries by the State Board of Elections. That means 21% of New York City's mail-in votes didn't count. 21%. In Brooklyn alone, 25% were mail-in votes and they were disqualified. Are you kidding me? I don't care who you vote for. If you voted, it should count. States have enough problems getting elections done on their own without throwing the U.S. Postal Service into the mix. Post office employees are not election officials, but now the Democrats are forcing vote by mail on the nation. Postal workers are expected to ensure that we have a fair election, and that is absurd because this is not a healthy organization. The Postal Service has been bleeding for over a decade. It's reported that a $4.5 billion loss for the first quarter of this year, and that's before the pandemic set in. Cutbacks and potential post office closures across the nations have left the USPS unable to handle their current load, much less when millions of ballots flood the system in late October and November.
When mail-in ballots begin flooding the system, what happens then?
You know, mail-in ballots and election mail are supposed to be prioritized by the Postal Service. So when they see it in the pile, they're supposed to prioritize and ensure that it gets delivered on time. However, these postal workers are telling us that the backlog could get so bad that it's going to be impossible for them to actually find that mail in the piles.
Oh, I hope we can wait a long, long, agonizing time between the vote and the actual results. CBS News recently conducted their own experiment, sending 100 mock ballots through the mail to see what would happen.
We found a bigger issue. 21% of our votes hadn't materialized after 4 days. And the batch we'd mailed a week prior, some of those were missing too.
So of our 100 ballots, 97 arrived, which sounds pretty good, unless you consider the fact that that means 3 people who tried to vote by mail in our mock election were in fact disenfranchised by mail.
If even just 1.5%, 2% of 130 million votes in November failed to arrive, that would mean several million votes might not count in the general election simply because they arrived too late or were lost in the mail. Does that sound good for either party? Does that sound good for the Republic? After the 2018 midterm elections, an audit by the Post Office Inspector General found the 7 lowest performing mail-in processing centers in the nation. They were in Wisconsin, Florida, Ohio, Maryland, New Jersey, California, and Illinois. Recognize a couple of swing states in that group? The new Postmaster General, businessman Louis DeJoy, was appointed to try to salvage the dumpster fire that is the USPS. But since DeJoy is a Trump guy, Democrats in the media have now carved out a new narrative that says that Trump is trying to ruin the USPS to sabotage voting by mail. It is a laughable conspiracy theory if you have the facts, but nobody's giving those to you. Postal Service problems are not new. These headlines are from 8 years ago when Obama was running for re-election, and the USPS had been a complete mess for years. And now it's Democrats trying to overwhelm an already broken mail system. With major flaws with voting by mail, coupled with Postal Service major challenges, they're setting up the nation for huge, huge problems and strife in November. After a quick break, I'm going to take you to the very credible nightmare scenario that could be Election Day 2020.